Chapter 11. Secrets in the Snow. The frozen pond that Crodus had fallen into was only about 50 paces wide, but it was clearly deep enough to drown a dwarf. The dark water that had been exposed at the center of the pond churned and seethed as Crodus desperately grabbed for the edges of the ice, but he kept breaking more away and repeatedly sank beneath the surface, dragged down by his huge backpack. "Rope!" Grog shouted as he lowered himself onto his hands and knees and began crawling across the ice. "Throw it out to me!" The ice burned and stung and stuck to Grog's hands as he crawled towards Crodus. Sheets of skin tore away from his palms and fingertips, but there was no time for an alternate plan. Crodus was choking, retching, and weakening. He'd clearly gone into shock and taken a reflexive breath whilst underwater. Grog had seen it before, and knew that he didn't have long before the amber-eyed warrior lost consciousness and was dragged into the depths by the weight of his pack, crammed as it was full of cooking gear and weapons. "Grog!" Tyrion's shout came a moment before a length of rope slapped down on the ice beside him. He grabbed hold of it, dropped onto his belly, and began sliding the last few feet before the ice gave way to water. "Crodus!" Grog shouted. "Grab hold!" He gathered a bunch of the rope in his hand and flicked it into the hole. The stricken warrior reached for the rope, missed, and disappeared beneath the frigid, swirling water. "Crodus!" Grog roared, daring to slide a little closer to the hole. He heard the sound of ice cracking. "Crodus!" Suddenly, the rope went taut. "Pull!" Grog shouted back at Tyrion and Orphan. "Pull as hard as you can!" It turned out that this was very hard indeed. The rope slithered back across the surface of the pond like an ice-flecked serpent, curving a furrow into the side of the hole until the golden helm of Crodus breached the surface and smashed into the ice. "Whoa, easy now!" Grog shouted. "Ease him back!" Tyrion and Orphan pulled. Crodus gasped and coughed and continued to break more ice away with a flailing arm. Grog backed up a little. "Stop thrashing around, you great loon!" Grog bellowed. "Just hold the rope and lay the other arm flat on the ice." Crodus's soggy left arm flopped onto the ice. Grog reached out, grabbed the unfortunate dwarf's frosty hand, and heaved. After a good deal of thrashing, splashing, tugging, and cursing, Grog, Tyrion, and Orphan were finally able to land their catch. Crodus was dragged, sliding like some kind of miserable, saturated toboggan, across the ice to the edge of the pond, where he lay on the snowy ground, coughing and shivering. "Get his clothes off," Grog said to Orphan as he clambered to his feet, sticking his frozen and torn hands under his armpits. "You get his clothes off," Orphan said, looking warily down at Crodus. "Oh, for the love of the Ancient Ones!" Tyrion exclaimed, dropping to her knees beside Crodus. "I'm adventuring with fucking children!" She freed Crodus from his backpack and began unclasping his dripping cloak. "No! No!" Crodus protested through chattering teeth. He raised a quivering hand to try and stop Tyrion, but she batted it away like she was shooing a fly. "You'd rather freeze to death than let us see you naked, would you?" Tyrion asked, finishing with the cloak and beginning to peel Crodus's waterlogged woolen shirt up off his belly. Crodus reached out again and tried to push Tyrion away. "Please, don't. His words were punctuated by hyperventilating breaths and filled with a strange and deep desperation. Tyrion remained on her knees, but straightened up and glared down at Crodus. "This is taking prudish to a whole new level, you damn fool! You've got to get out of these wet clothes. I'll be buggered if I'm going to help dig the second grave in 2 days." Crodus shook his head and tried to move away from Tyrion, but his body was shaking so violently that he was barely able to roll onto his side. Tyrion rolled her eyes and pulled a dagger from the sheath at her belt. "Come and help me with him!" she snapped at Orphan. Oh. Crodis moaned, but he had no strength to resist as Orifin pinned the frozen dwarf's arm by his side, and Terrian cut through the back of his sodden shirt from bottom to collar. She tore away the flaps of material and reeled back, a look of horror in her mismatched eyes. From where Grog stood, behind Orifin and looking at Crodis' anguished face, he couldn't see what Terrian had seen. But as Orifin pulled at the mangled shirt and wrenched it free from Crodis' frozen fingers, he saw the stricken dwarf's naked torso, and guessed that he and Terrian were seeing something similar. Grog had seen some battle-scarred bodies in his time, but he'd never seen anything like the gruesome canvas that Crodis' body had been turned into. His dark brown skin was absolutely covered in pale scars of varying lengths and widths. There were long, thin scars and short, jagged ones. There were wide circles and sunken, wrinkled gashes. But Grog's eyes flickered over all these, barely registering them. His gaze was drawn irresistibly to the scar that covered Crodis' broad chest. The shape of an eye wearing a crown had been carved into Crodis' flesh. It spanned his chest from armpit to armpit, with the top of the crown spikes reaching to the underside of his collarbone. Of all the dwarfs that walked the 13 realms, Grog knew that he was one of the very few who knew what that symbol represented. His head swam as he tried to process the implications of why that mark might have been gouged into Crodis' living flesh. It seemed that Terrian also recognized the mark, for Grog doubted she would have been so rattled by the scarring alone. Orifin, however, had not been rendered quite as hopelessly stunned as the others. "Does one of you want to grab him a fucking blanket, then?" he shouted, as he began pulling off Crodis' ice-crusted pants. Grog snapped out of his stupor and rushed for his backpack. Terrian helped strip Crodis down to his undergarments. Crodis lay on his side on the muddy earth, with his eyes tightly closed, shivering uncontrollably, and breathing in loud, rapid gasps. It took a considerable effort, but a short while later, they had Crodis wrapped in every dry blanket the party possessed, and lying on a canvas swag. Orifin and Terrian were gathering wood for a fire, and Grog was trying to get Crodis to drink some smolder whiskey. "Come on, you stupid bugger," Grog said, shaking the bottle close to Crodis' mouth, in what he felt was a tempting manner. Crodis did not drink. He also hadn't spoken or moved since they'd taken his shirt off. He just lay on his side, curled up, and shaking worse than a wagon full of sows going down a potholed lane. Grog made sure Terrian and Orifin weren't looking before he stole a large gulp of the whiskey for himself. "Oh, that's good stuff," he said, smacking his lips. "Warms you right up, that does." Crodis continued to tremble in silence. "I'm saying it," Grog thought to himself as he took another swig from the flask. "Crodis, I'm sorry we saw your scars, but I know what that is on your chest and back." Crodis opened his eyes, although they remained staring determinedly away from Grog. "I was once..." Grog paused to swallow the lump that had formed in his throat. "I was close with High King Owen. There weren't many secrets he kept from me. He told me about the Sovereign Shadows." Crodis looked up at Grog. "By the ancient ones, Crodis, what happened to you?" Grog could tell that the pain that flooded into Crodis' eyes and crumpled his face had nothing to do with the cold. The scarred dwarf bit his lip, closed his eyes, and with a groan of pain and effort, he rolled onto his other side, turning his back on Grog. "Fine, be that way," Grog thought, as he raised the flask to his mouth and downed the remaining contents. He was very much in the mood to get drunk. He had a pair of red raw frostbitten hands to add to his long and ever-growing list of injuries. He was also tired, filthy, freezing, and more than a little shaken up by the death of Major Hammerbuckle, and the bizarre and horrific scarring he'd just seen etched into the skin of Crodus. He made his way over to his pack, intending to fish out the large glass bottle of whiskey that he'd found amongst Major Hammerbuckle's belongings. He was just wondering whether he should bother refilling the metal flask, or whether he might just start drinking directly from the bottle, when he noticed something that made him very angry. "You bastards!" he yelled at the sky. "You cruel, heartless bastards!" Looming large on the western horizon were the jagged, mountainside rocks known as Kalian's Teeth, and drifting over these towering rocks was an ominous band of dark clouds. A spring storm was rolling in. Grog guessed they might have less than an hour to find some kind of shelter before the cursed Ancient Ones attacked them with lightning bolts and blasting rain. If they weren't able to keep Crodus dry and relatively warm, he really might die. "Tyrion!" Grog yelled. "Orifim, look!" The others looked up and followed his pointing finger. The string of expletives that Tyrion let loose was enough to make even Grog wince. "We need to find some shelter," she said, as she trudged back towards Grog and Crodus, dumping her armfuls of damp twigs. "Oh, you think so?" Grog asked, emboldened by his gutful of smolder whiskey. "'Cause I was just drawing your attention to those storm clouds, so you can admire how lovely they look as they come hurtling towards us." Tyrion wiped her hands on her breeches and gave Grog a look that might have made a troll cry. "Have you ever wanted to know what your intestines look like?" she asked in a conversational tone. "Because I could help you with that." "Save your strength, love," Grog said. "You're going to need it to help me drag this frozen lump over to those foothills." He jutted his chin towards the east and the mountain ranges they'd only just now climbed down from, and then his chin was jerked violently down. Tyrion had leaped forward, grabbed hold of Grog's bushy black beard with both hands, and yanked his face to within inches of her deadly glare. "Don't call me love. You got that? My name's Tyrion." "Oh, got that," Grog mumbled, barely able to move his jaw to form the words. Tyrion released him. "You've been drinking," she said, wrinkling up her nose. "At a time like this, you're fucking drinking." "Seems to me like this is the perfect time to be drinking," Grog said, rubbing his chin. "It's been a tough day." "Well, it's about to get even tougher." Tyrion looked down at Crodus, who remained curled up and shivering on the strip of canvas. "There's no way he's walking that far in this state. Are you sure there's some caves or somewhere to ride this out over there?" "Well, maybe not a cave, but those cliffs are absolutely riddled with old mines." We do have tents," Orifim said from behind Grog. "Ah, I've seen them," Grog said, "but I don't much like their chances against that." He gestured towards the roiling black clouds tumbling over the spiked peaks of Kalian's Teeth, and the streaks of lightning which were now ripping across the horizon. "I'd much rather some solid stone over my head when that hits, wouldn't you?" "Fine," Orifim said, with a sigh of resignation. "But if we're about to carry 4 packs and a solidly frozen dwarf a full mile or 2, I'm going to need you to relight this." He held up the pipe which Grog had dropped when Crodus had fallen into the pond. Much to Tyrion's annoyance, Grog and Orifim shared the rest of the pipe, and more than a few slugs of whiskey, while they bundled Crodus and his backpack onto the spread-out canvas of one of the tents. Once everything was secured, the 3 of them grabbed a couple of fistfuls of the edge each, and began to drag their quivering companion eastward. "So," Orifim puffed after they'd been dragging for a few minutes, "does one of you want to tell me what in the name of the Ancient Ones we all just saw back there?" "Storm," Tyrion said. Pond, Grog added. You know that's not what I'm talking about. We know, Grog confirmed. Just save your breath for pulling, Tyrion added. And so they labored in silence, sliding their strange cargo across the melting snow, listening to the rumbling thunder growing louder behind them, and feeling the wind gathering strength. The first frigid drops of rain began to fall, when they were still a few hundred paces from the rocky cliff walls. Grog could already make out the entrance to one of the many dwarven mines which burrowed into the solid rock. But progress had slowed to almost a standstill. Grog was utterly exhausted, and his companions weren't doing much better. Even Tyrion, who'd definitely taken the dragon's share of the weight, was struggling to haul the damp canvas over the now sloping ground. When the deep, but still shaky, voice of Crodus reached his ears, Grog could have turned around and hugged him. I can walk, Crodus said. Where are my boots? Here! Tyrion retrieved them from behind Crodus's backpack. Grog knew they should be saying things like, Oh, are you sure, Crodus? But the wind was now buffeting them with gusts of ever-increasing force, and the gigantic grey curtain of rain that was sweeping across the tundra was almost upon them. They helped the blanket-wrapped dwarf get to his feet and put his boots on. Tyrion picked up his pack, and they took off for the cliffs as fast as their aching legs could carry them, which, in Crodus's case, was exactly as fast as snails aren't. Come on, pal, Grog yelled as Crodus staggered up the muddy, slush-covered slope. Nearly there! Whatever bastard god was in charge of rain decided to hold back the full force of the storm until the party had almost reached the entrance to the mine. This was just long enough for Grog to kindle a glimmer of hope that they might just make it inside without getting too wet. Then, with a deafening blast of thunder, the skies opened up, and within seconds, all four of them were soaked to the core. Well, now that's fucking brilliant, Thorfinn said, dumping his pack onto the floor of the mine as soon as they entered. Now we've got no dry blankets to put this bugger in. He pointed at Crodus, who'd entered last, and was dripping prodigiously all over the stone floor. Stop whining and look in the packs, Tyrion said. You do that. Thorfinn unclasped his battle-axe from his pack. I'm going to chop down some timber from those beams back there. He began walking deeper into the tunnel. We've got to have a fire. Grog dropped his pack and knelt down beside it, searching inside for dry clothing. You're going to have to get out of those blankets, he said to Crodus. Don't worry, me and Tyrion will look the other way. Crodus said nothing. He just stood close to the mouth of the tunnel, shivering and staring out at the torrential rain. A shout from Thorfinn echoed down the tunnel, and it sure as shit wasn't a happy shout. Thorfinn! Grog called, getting to his feet and placing his hands on the hilts of his two short swords. There was a muffled thud, and the sound of something hard clattering on the stone. Thorfinn! Grog yelled again, drawing his weapons and breaking into a run. Tyrion was beside him. Together they sprinted deeper into the mine. Together they raised their weapons, as Grog saw Thorfinn's boots slide into the darkness of an alcove some distance ahead, as though their titanium-clad companion was being dragged away. Together they roared an impotent cry of anguish as a slab of stone began to slide across the opening. The last thing Grog saw in the shadows before the stone door shut was the face of a dwarf, painted in a combination of dark and mustard-colored paints, grinning out at him like a hideous skull. Grog and Tyrion arrived at the door and began throwing themselves against it. They screamed Thorfinn's name. They broke their fingernails trying to wrench it back. Tyrion picked up Thorfinn's battle-axe from where it lay on the floor and tried to pry the door open. Nothing they did had the slightest effect. Where is he? Grog turned to see Crodus standing behind them. He was holding his hatchets and wearing nothing but wet undergarments and a multitude of pale scars. "He's gone," Grog said, pressing his palm against the cold, unyielding stone. "The bastards have taken him."